Good afternoon. My name is Dilara Nakiboglu, and I will be your moderator for our book discussion with Dr. Considine on his recently released book, The Humanity of Muhammad. Dr. Craig Considine is a scholar, professor, global speaker, media contributor, and public intellectual based at the Department of Sociology at Rice University. He is the author of many books and articles. Dr. Considine's opinions have been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, BBC, CBS News, Fox News, MSNBC, Newsweek, and Al Jazeera. He has been invited to speak at some of the leading international organizations and universities in the world. Dr. Considine is visible on social media. He holds a PhD from Trinity College, MS from Royal Holloway, University of London, and BA from American University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Considine is a U.S. Catholic of Irish and Italian descent. Dr. Considine's book discusses several important aspects of Prophet Muhammad's, peace be upon him, principles of social justice and transformation, including his anti-racism, his pluralism, and how the Prophet, peace be upon him, advocated and promoted women's rights. Before I turn it over to Dr. Considine, I want to go over the layout of the program. After Dr. Considine introduces himself, I will dive right into some questions that were prepared by our young members of the Peace Islands Institute. Once we get through those questions, and if we still have time, we will have a small Q&A by those who submit their questions through the YouTube chat box. All right, Dr. Considine, it's all you now.
Thank you, Dilara, and thank you for everyone joining today. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a beautiful Sunday here in Houston, and I hope wherever you are, it's not snowing. I just got off FaceTime with my sister in Boston, and she turned the phone and she said, "Look outside." And I said, "You know what? I actually wish I was there. I miss home. I haven't been to Boston in a long time because of COVID." So I hope this finds you well. I'm excited for our session today, which is covering The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View, which is my latest book. Very, very thankful to have worked with Blue Dome Press, which is based in Clifton, New Jersey. These are the publishers of the book. A fantastic team of editors, of scholars who were really a thrill for me to work with. And, all credit really goes to them in terms of the quality and the production of the book. So the book itself, before we get into the questions, just to give you like a minute or two kind of overview, it's really a labor of love. And I recently posted this on social media. This was my first opportunity really to put down into writing, into a book, my views on Prophet Muhammad as a whole. I've talked about him in my previous books, but this one was the first one dedicated to him entirely. And as a sociologist, I approach his life and legacy through sociological terms. And as Dilara was saying, anti-racism, religious pluralism, women's rights. And there's also a chapter on Muhammad's vision of the Ummah as a civic nation. And I also dedicate a chapter to seeking knowledge and the golden rule. So from a sociological perspective, those are the angles. And obviously in the title, it also says a Christian view. So I make sure to insert myself, my own lived experience, my own history into the equation, so the reader gets a feel for who I am as a person and as a fellow monotheist believer. So that is the book in a nutshell, and I'm sure we're going to dive a lot deeper into the heart and the content of the book in the Q&A. So looking forward to it.
Thank you so much for that wonderful intro, Dr. Considine. So I would like to begin with our first question. In our current society, although there are some people who understand what it means to be a true Muslim, there are no Muslim governments that do so. Muslims look to blame the Western colonialists in the world. They say that with the continuation of a political, economic, and social hegemony up until the second half of the 20th century, not only are Muslims unable to live by their true religious values, but this also leads to the rise of radical Islamic groups. Do you agree with these opinions held by some Muslims? If not, how would you explain the current situation we are in?
So this is a question that is pretty complicated, and I don't think the answer or the solution, because it sounds like the person asking the question is kind of looking for a solution. I don't think it's very straightforward, and I don't think there's kind of one solution that will kind of cure this quagmire. I don't think that we should dismiss the impact of colonialism. I think that is it was a very impactful, long, arduous process that fundamentally transformed not merely people's everyday life, but it really challenged people's commitment to faith. Because if you think about what colonialism was in this context, with the quote Muslim world, you had Westerners coming over and a lot of the times imposing secularism, kind of taking religion out of the equation, the societal equation, the governmental equation. And I think that can be pretty traumatic for people when you strip away something that is dear to them. And I think when the kind of chains of colonialism were officially broken off, I think a lot of nations around the world defined themselves in opposition to the colonial years. So a lot of nations were saying, we are not them. We are not secular. We are different. And in doing that, and you kind of overcompensate and you kind of return to religion with almost too much fervor. To give you an example, as someone who studied Irish history a lot, Ireland was a colony of England, of Britain, for 800 years. And when the Irish started breaking these colonial chains, they literally, as a nation, for the most part, defined themselves in exact opposition to the English. So the English were Protestant, the Irish had to be Catholics. The English were Anglo-Saxon, the Irish had to be Gaelic and Celtic. The English and British were individual oriented, the Irish Catholics had to be collectivist oriented. And it became very rigid, where this was the only type of national identity that people could express. But it was very defensive, and I hope you can see that. You know, it's like people just unhappy with the experience that they've had, and they said, these are our enemies. We cannot be like them. And I think this example played out in the so-called Muslim world in the post-colonial years, where people are defensive in a way. So I sympathize in some ways with the reluctance to see any form of good in colonialism and this kind of rebellion against it. However, I am not in favor of rigid interpretations of faith and rigid interpretations of nations that essentially create a tribal dynamic. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in the so-called Muslim world, where it feels in some ways in nations a bit insecure, a bit too defensive. And perhaps some leaders around the world in these governments would do well to kind of reimagine what a Muslim nation is. And that's something I try to do in the book, even as a Christian. This is why I talk about the civic nation. A civic nation is a nation in which anyone can belong to. What makes you belong to the nation is not your religion, your ethnicity, your culture, any of that, your racial components. What makes you belong to the nation is a set of laws, principles, It's a philosophy. It's a contract. It's a social contract that anyone can belong to. And I think there are nations around the world, again, they happen to be Muslim majority, who don't have that. And that's concerning. But again, as an American, I have plenty of concerns about my own government, and we're supposed to be a civic nation too. So I'm not trying to bash countries around the world. Certainly the US has plenty of problems too.
Thank you, Dr. Considine. Yeah, unfortunately, everyone has their own idea of like what their idea of a Muslim country is supposed to look like, and that's why it's just a mess all over the world. So, okay, on to the second question. In the 117th page of your book, you state that you do not believe in everything you read about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and even Moses and Jesus. Does this mean that you do not trust the sources that certain information comes from? Or do you see prophets as people who make mistakes and give false information at times? If it's the second option, how can a person who isn't a role model in every way be a prophet, a messenger, and guide people closer to God? How can you explain this opinion to a person who doesn't see people who don't believe in all prophets as a Muslim?
So it's a complex question, and it's a tricky one. And I think it's one that needs to be handled pretty carefully. And if it's not handled carefully, it could get me into a lot of trouble. But I mean, some of the language in the article, I would in the question, I would push back on. Like, I'm definitely not suggesting that, revered prophets and human beings throughout history, Moses, Abraham, Jesus, Muhammad, David, and so on. I'm not accusing them of giving false information. That's not something that I would do, and it's not something that I believe is constructive, and therefore I wouldn't engage in that type of rhetoric. However, what I will say is there are definitely things in holy texts which I don't think necessarily apply to a modern context. And I think if we take holy texts literally sometimes, it can be a bit problematic in terms of striking a balance between religion and modernity. So to give an example, like there are some hadith that say, Muhammad is encouraging the believers and the Muslims to wear sandals all the time and to wear sandals a certain way. I mean, something like that. I mean, if we read it literally, okay, but if I'm in Antarctica, freezing my behind off, I'm not going to wear sandals. That wouldn't make sense. And I don't think Muhammad would expect me to wear sandals. So what I mean in the book when I'm talking about these type of things, I'm pushing the reader away from this tendency for human beings to engage in a literal interpretation of the text. In terms of Jesus, we have stories in the New Testament, in the Gospel specifically, in which Jesus is engaging in miraculous acts, healing the blind, walking on water. And for me, someone who is a firm believer in rationality and the importance of incorporating rationality into my own kind of modern interpretation of religion, sometimes it's difficult to believe some of these stories. Literally. However, do I think Jesus helped to cure the blind man? I do. Do I think that he literally cured him? I'm not sure. But I do know that Jesus did something to that man that helped him see, even if it's not a literal sight. He lifted his spirit. He brought him to a different plane that made this person feel good. So this is kind of what I'm talking about on page 117. I think we need to understand the historical contexts in which some of these verses were revealed in terms of the Quran. And I do think with the Bible, and this is my own interpretation, I do feel like a lot of the gospel is meant to be symbolically interpreted. And call me a heretic for that. I'm sure a lot of Christians probably would, but that's where I stand on those issues.
Thank you, Dr. Considine. That was very well put together. Thank you. So number 3, in advanced countries around the world, do you see a change in the way Islam and Muslims are looked at? If so, is this change in a positive or negative way? More importantly, what are the factors that impacts these changes?
Well, I think I could start by talking about, the country that I've spent the majority of my life in, which is the US, the country I was born in. I think we would consider it an advanced country. In terms of how this country sees Islam and Muslims, it's tough to say. I think there have been some good developments in recent years, but there's also moments where it feels like we're going and sliding back into a heavier environment of Islamophobia. I think we see most of the heavier Islamophobia coming from politicians and coming from the media, which I'll talk about in a second. But I do think among a significant amount of Americans in this country and the goodwill that I believe is in this country, I do think people are starting to decipher and starting to move beyond the stereotypes, moving beyond this idea that Muslims should be viewed through the vacuum and the prism of terrorism and of violence. And like this idea that only Muslims commit acts of terrorism. I think America is starting to catch up with this, and they're starting to kind of see beyond the propaganda. And I have no problem in calling that propaganda. So there is this, it's about literacy. I think Americans are becoming smarter with media and not falling for like some kind of Fox News narratives. And I do think that more, and this is a fact actually, more Muslims are involved in local, state, and national politics in this country than ever before. Which tells us a few things. It tells us that Muslims are quite active. They're feeling a bit more comfortable with engaging in the civic realm, which is good. But also these people are being democratically elected, which means that people have faith in them, not merely as a religious person, but as elected officials, which is a big deal in a democracy. So, it kind of goes both ways. And if we apply this to Europe too, I think the same kind of model that I just gave can apply to the European context. You have certain countries, Austria comes to mind, that has politicians and leaders who are a bit more ethnocentric and Islamophobic, and they're getting into positions of power. But I think if you engage with the European public, many of them would be on the side of kind of transcending Islamophobia. Perhaps I'm an optimist in this regard, but I do trust the overall goodwill of Westerners and Christians. I will say this: the factors that impact the changes in a good way or a bad way ultimately come down to the media. And that may seem overly simplistic, but I think it's true. Study after study has revealed that there's a correlation between lack of familiarity with Muslims and lack of encounters with Muslims and negative perceptions of Muslims. So in the US context, most of the people who have unfavorable views of Islam and Muslims are people who don't know Islam or Muslims. So they're generating these ideas from where? The media. It's pretty obvious. I mean, where else are people going to be getting their information from? And media is a big sphere. It's not just traditional media, newspapers and CNN and Fox and CBS. It's social media as well. So the media, as always, is the gift and the curse It allows us to network. It allows us to communicate in a swifter and more orderly fashion. However, we need to be very careful with the type of information we digest and the type of information that we let connect to our mind and our hearts and our souls, because sometimes this information is just not accurate. So the media is a huge player in determining the perception of Muslims, whether it's negative or positive.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Dr. Considine, for that as well. There is a term called Judeo-Christian. With that in mind, can someone be a Christian Muslim?
Yeah, I think a human being, if they wish to identify themselves as a Christian Muslim, if they feel that there's a compatibility between these two identity types, if they believe in elements of both faith traditions, who are we, or at least in my perspective, who am I to tell someone they can or cannot be this or that? Because ultimately what we're talking about here is a person's lived experience, a person's autonomy and agency to determine who they are and what they believe. And I'm not a fan of identity police, telling people they can believe this or they can't believe that. And if you do believe this, as some of these identity police officers go, if you do believe this, then you're not that. I just think a lot of this this culture around policing identity is very unhealthy. And it actually reminds me of some of the most detrimental moments in history, both within Christianity and Islam. If we go to the Protestant Reformation, and you had a massive split within Christendom, and you had these kind of breakaway groups from the church who wanted to be independent and who had different views of what it meant to be Christian. And if you look at what happened, you had literally deadly wars over hundreds of years over power and interpretations of faith. And I think in the Islamic context, we don't even need to go necessarily into history to make this point of the dangers of heresy. We have it right in front of our eyes today, because a lot of the wars that we're seeing in which Muslims happen to be engaged in are sectarian wars. You know, and obviously power and money and all this stuff, power politics comes into play. But to dismiss sectarianism and the role that they play in these conflicts would not be a wise move. So if a person wants to be Christian and Muslim, there's enough similarities between the faith traditions that it would make sense. I mean, if we were to say someone can be an atheist and a Christian at the same time, or an atheist or a Muslim at the same time, I mean, that's a bit more problematic. But I also would never deny someone the right to be that or to think that and to believe that. But in terms of being a Christian Muslim, sure. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Though I would love to hear more about whether there are Christian Muslims in the world and how they define their faith. That would be quite interesting. I know there are Messianic Jewish populations around the world who claim to be Jews, yet they recognize Jesus as the Messiah, which is quite interesting in its own right. So interesting food for thought, and definitely something that I don't think we think a lot about, this kind of hybrid emergence of religious identities.
I guess to follow up with that question, do you support a Judeo-Christian Islamic worldview or system of thought?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I've always found it, well, I wouldn't say always, because I wasn't familiar with the monotheistic tradition until I started studying Islam back in college when I was 18 and 19. But once I started understanding where Islam came from and the long history and the line of prophets and what inspired Muhammad and what Muhammad spoke about, I started realizing that we're actually missing a hyphen. There should be a third hyphen here: Judeo-Christian Islamic worldview, system of thought. And I think it's also important to recognize not simply that there are theological similarities here, rooted in, let's say, monotheism, sacred texts, the Day of Judgment, the presence of prophets, and so on and so forth. There's so many theological similarities, and we could spend a whole session on that. But I think it's equally important to recognize that these three terms, Judeo, Christian, and Islamic, have not been divorced from each other throughout history. It's almost like, okay, Judeo-Christian has been one thing throughout history, and it's had no interaction with the Islamic, which is just categorically and factually false. And we have so many examples in history where Jews, Christians, and Muslims were actually flourishing together, right? So it's not merely a theological argument to say that we need that second hyphen to add the Islamic. It's a fact of history that Christians, Muslims, and Jews have worked together, struggled together, created civilization together, pushed knowledge forward together. And it's been done throughout history, right? So this is an important historical fact that should support the theological similarities between these three Abrahamic traditions.
Thank you, Dr. Considine. Now shifting to racism. Do you think racism is on the rise all over the world? If you think so, how can we deal with it? How could the example of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, especially A, the Prophet's teachings on equality and justice, B, him personally embracing African former slaves, adopting them, and even promoting them to head an army of highly experienced, wise companions, be a means of overcoming racism?
I mean, I think it sure feels like racism is on the rise all over the world. There's ethnocentrism everywhere. We have political leaders all across the globe who are pushing ethnocentrism. We had it done here in the United States over the last 4 years. I mean, Brazil comes to mind, Austria comes to mind, elements of Brexit has ethnocentric components. What China is doing to the Uyghur Muslims is not merely ethnocentric, it's genocidal. But a large part of this movement to exclude the Uyghur population of Western China is because they're not Han Chinese. They don't belong to the majority, quote, tribe. What's happening to the Rohingya in Myanmar? So yeah, I mean, it sure feels it. And I think a lot of you would probably agree with that. And of course, we had the Black Lives Matter movement over the summer, which is still, that's an ongoing movement. But I would say also, I would love to see it quantified. I would love to see studies on global racism, to see the impact of ethnocentric politicians, to see where public opinion stands in every country around the world on issues pertaining to racial equality and anti-racism. I think it's important. I wouldn't be surprised if these studies came out and basically approved of the theory that I just provided, which is, I think racism is indeed on the rise. So it needs to be studied. In terms of how do we deal with racism, I'm looking at the question here. How do we overcome it? Again, there's no simple solution. I think it needs to be a multi-tiered approach. I think number one, and we see this through the life and legacy of Prophet Muhammad, is that of allyship. Being allies to one another does not merely mean holding views on racial equality, does not merely mean holding views, religiously tolerant views. It actually means, kind of putting your foot down and standing with people, and at times, being there for people who are marginalized, who are experiencing some form of oppression. It's interesting in the life of Muhammad, and I talk about this in the book, the first hijrah, while Muhammad was not physically in Abyssinia, when King Ibn Abjar protected the Muslims from being basically extradited to Mecca, where they certainly probably would have died at the hands of the Quraysh. Muhammad wasn't there. He was there in spirit, for sure. And this is a really important lesson for all of us, Christians and Muslims in particular, because King Ibn Abjar, he didn't merely open the doors of Abyssinia to a community that needed shelter, but he literally defended them in front of the Quraysh, if you believe the historical sources, which I do. He literally defended them. He's saying, not for a mountain of gold will I give these people back up to you. This is the Christian king Ibn Abjar. He said that to the Quraysh. And then, that's extraordinary. Imagine what would have happened if this king said, I'm not sure about these Muslim people. I think they're lying about something, or I don't trust them. What would have happened? So he put himself on the line. He put his empire on the line. Think about that. He didn't know how the Quraysh were going to respond, and saying basically, Quraysh, no way, I'm not giving them up. That could have initiated a war, and he seemingly was ready to do that. So being an ally is fundamental, and we see lessons of allyship through the life and legacy of Muhammad. The second thing in terms of overcoming racism is having more encounters with people who don't look like us, think like us, behave like us, and with people who do not have similar historical backgrounds as us. So literally getting uncomfortable and immersing yourself in places where you're a stranger and learning about others through a firsthand experience. Entering homes, places of worship, schools, businesses, and having authentic relationships with people, at least trying to form authentic relationships. This is what Muhammad is all about. Being sincere, being humble, giving off an aura of comfort and hospitality. These are all really fundamental things that I admire about his life. And of course, we have allyship, encounter, and then knowledge. Religious literacy is so important to overcoming racism. Last night, I was on another panel with Reverend Steve Babber, an African-American Methodist reverend, who was amazing. And he was stressing to all of us that we as Americans will not transcend all of these racial divisions and the racism until Americans properly understand what has happened in history. So Reverend Steve is saying we need to be literate. We need to be knowledgeable of what has happened throughout history, because what is happening today is not divorced from the generations before us. So overcoming racism requires an immense amount of energy and dedication and time. And it, I think, involves these three processes: allyship, encounter, and knowledge.
Absolutely. And those were wonderful words by Reverend Steve as well. Thank you so much for sharing that. So question number 7, as you may know, it was an act of worship for Muslims to emancipate slaves during those times. How could these great acts of respect towards our African brothers and sisters serve to promote equality, justice, and prevent oppression?
It's an important question, and it's one that I reflect on in chapter 3 of the book on anti-racism. And I think the best way to prevent racial views on racial superiority and to prevent racial attacks from happening is to engage not merely in non-racism, but anti-racism. And there's a distinction between these two terms. To be a non-racist person is one that holds views on racial equality. So they don't think that certain people who look a certain way are inherently superior to other groups of people who don't look that way, right? So a non-racist is, to put it kind of simply, a person who believes in human equality, who believes that first and foremost we're human. We all bleed the same, we all have the same organs, we have the same emotions, we cry, we laugh, we love our family members, we struggle. I mean, this is what comes to mind when I think about a non-racist. But I use this exercise in class often, usually on the first day of class. And I say, who in here is a non-racist? And everyone puts their hand up. And the follow-up question makes things a bit more interesting, where I say, well, who in here is an anti-racist? And people kind of look around a little bit, not sure where other people stand and not sure where they stand on this issue, because there's a difference. A anti-racist is a person who holds non-racist views, but they actually deliberately and consciously act and take measures to dismantle the racism. Because when you're anti, there's something more kind of aggressive about it than just merely being non. And Muhammad was, as I argue in the book, he was an anti-racist. He wasn't merely holding views on racial equality. We know that. The Quran is quite clear on this. And he's quite clear on it in other elements of his life, specifically the farewell sermon. But we also know through the early sources, the Hadith and the Sirah, that he was doing much more than merely talking a good game, just saying, oh yeah, I believe in racial equality. So I'll give you a few examples. And I focus on Bilal ibn Rabah in the book, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with Bilal. He was mixed race. His father was Arab and his mother was from Abyssinia, modern day Ethiopia. He looked differently. He was darker than most people in Mecca at the time. And he was also enslaved. And after Muhammad started revealing his messages to the public, there was an encounter that Abu Dhar al-Ghifari, Bilal, and Muhammad had. And Abu Dhar and Bilal were in a conversation that actually turned into a heated conversation. And Abu Dhar basically, in frustration with Bilal, condemns Bilal's action and behavior, and then at the end of the condemnation says, "You're the son of a black woman," which basically connects one's behavior with the inferiority of their race. And you can imagine at this time Muhammad listening to this to his two friends, and he's probably doing a face palm to Abu Dhar and says to Abu Dhar, this view, and I'm kind of going off the cuff and paraphrasing, but he said, this view that you had in attacking someone because of the way they look and their ancestry is a part of Jahiliyyah, which is the Arabic term that many of you are probably familiar with, that refers to the age of ignorance, which is basically equating ignorance and racism. You can't be knowledgeable and hold views on racial superiority. And arguably, you can't be Muslim if you believe in racial superiority. So Muhammad could have easily been a non-racist and sat there while this conversation was happening and not said anything. But knowing inside, he's like, I disagree. But he acted on it. He defended his friend. And we also know that Muhammad freed Bilal, literally freed him and his hands from the chains in which he was bonded in. And I think this is really important too. And it goes to stress, it elaborates, I think, on the anti-racist, the active element here. Muhammad didn't merely free Bilal, but he allowed Bilal to thrive. Muhammad was creating an environment, a tolerant environment, an inclusive environment in which people wouldn't just be free, that they were able to climb, let's call it the social ladder. They were able to be socially mobile. They were able to maximize their potential. And we know that Bilal ends up being one of the most important companions of the early Ummah. So this is how you prevent racism from happening. You don't merely think about it. You act on your thoughts. You act on that non-racism. And in many ways, you take a stand. You put your foot down. And it takes courage, but if you're in it for the right reasons, then you'll do it and you won't be concerned with the ramifications.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Considine. So question number 8, on page 117 of your book, you say, quote, I believe that God will continue to send prophets to earth so long as human beings are living on the planet, end quote. However, in the Bible, Jesus says that a last prophet will come after him, and Islam says that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the last messenger. With the clash between your view and those of the Bible and Quran, where does your belief come from, and what do you base your claim off of?
My belief comes from me. It comes from my soul, comes from my heart, comes from my head, comes from my experience. It comes from that little voice inside of me that I think is really our creator who guides me. It comes from my ability to rationalize, and it also is informed by my lived experiences. I mean, ultimately, I'm a free spirit, and I'm not going to have my religious views dictated by texts with people who have a certain interpretation of a given text, which can be rigid sometimes. Like even with the part of this question says, Jesus says that a last prophet will come. I'm not familiar with this passage. I am familiar with the passage in John in which Jesus talks about a prophet coming. And I talk about this in the conclusion of the book. I say I have no problem with people saying that this could be Muhammad, but I'm not familiar with the passage in which Jesus says that there's going to be a last prophet. Now, in terms of Muhammad, I've long said that I don't believe that he's going to be the last prophet. I think it's just not feasible for me, considering the power of God and my belief of God and his power and his unpredictability and what this creator, this essence, this force above us in which all of this comes from. I mean, he can't be done with us. That's my position on it. I just, I don't think it's part of his plan. I think he will continue to send us messengers, if you want to call them prophets, so long as we're here. So I understand my views are a bit unorthodox, but again, I'll go back to what I stressed earlier too about the identity police. And I think it's dangerous to go down the route of, engaging in like this people engaging as if they're like belief officers, that they're able to basically position people outside of religious categories based on their belief. I mean, first and foremost, I say that I'm a Christian. And if someone has a problem with my belief and doesn't think I'm a Christian, that's fine. But if I say I'm a Christian, then I'm a Christian. It's not up for other people to determine what I am. They may disagree with me, but ultimately we're talking about human agency and autonomy. We have to give people the autonomy to believe what they wish. And I think this is really important. And it goes back to the charge of heresy. So in my position, in viewing Muhammad as a prophet gets me into trouble with Christians. Not viewing Muhammad as the last prophet gets me in trouble with Muslims. So I'm basically being excluded by multiple people on multiple fronts from various religious communities. Now, thankfully, this does not do any harm to me. I am not threatened by this. And I thank God that I have an environment around me in which people are not trying to physically attack me. But there are people around the world who hold views about certain religious issues that face life and death persecution and matters. And who am I to say that one day people who think like me will not be in the situation like a lot of religious minority populations are in today? So I think this is a very, very dangerous game that people go down when they try to police people's identities and beliefs. I think we need to move away from this. And I think we need to let people be, so long as they're not causing trouble and problems. And I don't think that's something that I've been doing, but people disagree.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Considine. You draw attention to the religious pluralism of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where the Najran Christians were invited to the mosque in Medina and hosted there for a conference. The Christian group were also given the permission to hold a service in the mosque. How could this event be an example to interreligious dialogue between Christians and Muslims today?
This is, I think, one of the most important interfaith moments in the history of the world. And it's arguably the first official diplomatic encounter that we know of, at least, between Christians and Muslims. And by the way, I have another book coming out, shameless plug here, coming out in May or June, called People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounters with Christians. And I dedicate a whole chapter to who the Christians of Najran were. And of course, this event that we're talking about here. So there's a few key lessons that I think we can take away. And the first is civility. We know through the early historical sources that the Christians of Najran enter into the masjid in Medina, Prophet Muhammad's masjid, and they engage in a critical dialogue about something that, especially for Christians and Muslims, is quite complex: Christology, the nature of Jesus. Who is he? Is he divine? Is he not divine? Is he sort of divine and sort of something else, sort of human? You can imagine that the Christians of Najran especially were probably like, well, who are these people? Basically saying that our prophet or our God and our Jesus is not who we think he is. So you can kind of imagine things could get pretty tense. Things could get pretty ugly. And these are strangers coming together. But we know that there was a civil dialogue, and that the sides agreed to disagree without engaging in name calling, without it spiraling out of control to the point where they would not be able to sustain relations in the future. The importance of civil dialogue is something that is so important, not only to Christians and Muslims today, but to us as Americans. If you're in America right now and listening, we need more civility in our public discourse. And I think I'm largely pointing the finger at our politicians, who sometimes it feels like they're some misbehaving middle schoolers calling each other names and unable to see eye to eye. So the civility is paramount. I'd say the second major takeaway from this encounter is Prophet Muhammad's hospitality. We know that he's being hospitable in opening his doors. Even sending the invitation itself is an act of, it's an inviting act. But we know, again, through the historic sources, and I mentioned this in the book, that Muhammad provided the Christians of Najran space to pray inside the masjid. Now, this gets back to Muhammad's preference, I think, for the golden rule: treat others how you would want to be treated. The Christians of Najran were about to leave the masjid and go pray outdoors, which you can imagine at this time in 630, probably not a conducive place in the middle of the street in Medina or whatever it might have been. It wasn't a conducive place to properly pray. And the Christians of Najran have never been to this space before either. So Muhammad, I think in his mind, he's saying, what is the right thing to do in terms of being a hospitable host? And he says, come back into the mosque and you can use this mosque to pray. Now, the other key element here, in my opinion, is not merely the hospitality, but the example that Muhammad was setting. And I think the example that he was setting was this: you do not compromise your faith, and God does not punish you or criticize you for being hospitable. I think that's a really important point. And a lot of people would be uncomfortable, Christians and Muslims, with letting people pray in their space because they think it's a sacred space and they think that they're defaming their God in doing so. But if we look at this differently and we just say, okay, what does God expect of his creation, of his people? God, our creator, has sustained us, has given us so much, has given us life. Certainly, we have to treat each other in an equally open, inclusive, and merciful way. So some people would say, well, it's blasphemous. You can't do it. You can't let other people from other faith traditions inside your space to pray. I would just look at it as say, hey, we're being a good host. To me, that's what it means to be a Christian, to be a good host, to take care of people, to make sure people feel comfortable, warm, and secure. So I think that's an important point. We need to move beyond this idea that certain acts jeopardize our faith and God is going to punish us for doing something as nice as being hospitable.
Thank you. How did Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, transform a society that killed or buried their daughters alive into one where women are respected, able to inherit, and have the right to divorce?
Good question. Important question. First and foremost, he ended the killing of daughters that were basically identified as useless. So he ended that practice, and then he opened up society a little bit and provided the issues that are mentioned in the question: divorce rights, the ability to inherit, property and resources. So, like, kind of legally, if I could put it that way, he basically changed legislation in a way. In the modern context, it's like creating new kind of rights, new policy. But I think there's something bigger than that. And I think we see this bigger example through the relationships that he had with the women around him. And in the book, I dedicate a whole chapter to women's rights. And I wish that the chapter was longer. I think every author would like to go back to their book and change it up a little bit. If I had to do a second edition, I would make the women's rights chapter longer. But I focus on two women in his life, Khadija and Aisha. And I think both of these women have many similarities that tell us a lot about who they are, of course. So they're independent, strong, successful, intelligent, also loving, affectionate, and caring. Basically, really well-rounded human beings, not just women, human beings. Obviously, their characteristics tell us who they are. But because Muhammad was in relation to them as a husband, I think it also tells us a lot about Muhammad's approach to women in general. I mean, Khadija was 15 years older than he was, a lot wealthier than he was in terms of actually financial resources, had a much different status, a higher status, was probably more well known. And if you think of it today, and not to put my fellow men down here, but I think a lot of men would be uncomfortable with entering into relations, something as serious as marriage, with a woman who had this type of powerful force with them. I think the ego gets involved, and some men want a more submissive person, sadly. But Muhammad didn't seem to care about that. There was something that he genuinely admired about Khadijah that was about principle, it was about morality. And I think he genuinely admired her. And I think the same could be true of Aisha. So I think it's much bigger than these laws that he kind of changed. It's almost like a theory on how to think about women and to think about their place in society. I think that's the main takeaway. At least the emphasis that I placed on his views on women in the book itself.
Definitely. Yeah, women do play a huge role in like the Muslim society. And I wish like everyone would, see that and realize that. So next question. You stated at the end of page 61 how Muhammad, peace be upon him, renders the remark of saying, quote, an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab, end quote. So even though us Muslims follow Muhammad to the best of our abilities, why do you think that there is still racial inequality, not only in our world today, but within our Muslim communities?
I think racism is absolutely not inherent to the human experience, the human condition, being human. When a baby comes out of the womb, the baby is not racist, which tells us that racism is socially constructed. It's programmed into us. Literally, it gets infiltrated into our minds and into our hearts through words, images, the example that people close to us in our life set around us. And we see it and we pick up on it and it gets ingrained in us. So it's not real. It's make believe. It's socially constructed. In the modern context, racism is continuing to persist. And I go back to the media here because of the way that some people, groups of people, some nations around the world are framed in the media. I've written a paper that you can find online. You can download it for free. It's called The Racialization of Islam, Islamophobia, Hate Crimes, and Flying While Brown. And the data in this paper that I used focused on several hate crimes in which the perpetrator, the criminal, attacks another human being, thinking that they're Muslim, viewing them through the prism of violence and terrorism. But all the while, these people were not even Muslim. So these criminals who carried out these attacks have been programmed to think not only that a Muslim could be potentially violent or backward or anything like this, but that they look a certain way. And in the classic kind of stereotype, it's someone who looks like a traditional Arab person, and people act on these measures. So racism is programmed. I know this might sound messed up, but I feel bad for people who are racist because they've been duped. They've been brainwashed. They've taken the propaganda bait. And it's not natural. It's a human creation. I also would say this, and this builds off of the programming that I just mentioned, is the arrogance. So when people start developing these ideas of racial superiority, they like to cling on to it because it gives them a sense of pride and power. And this is where arrogance comes in. People don't want to deconstruct their minds and their hearts. They don't want to unprogram the racism because racism makes them feel powerful. It's a false sense of power and empowerment. And people don't want to let it go because of the ego. People, for whatever reason, are probably insecure, and they themselves feel inferior. And the only way for them to kind of feel a little better is to project this inferiority onto other people, and to kind of come across as superior. So I think there's three layers to it, really. Racism is programmed. Racism leads to arrogance, and the arrogance crushes the soul, and people aren't able to really have an honest conversation about, why they hold these negative views about other people.
So continuing with the topic on racism, these last questions are actually just related to racism. Why do you think no one acknowledges Muhammad's, peace be upon him, continuous fight toward anti-racism? Shouldn't everyone use him as an example to spread love?
I would push back on this, actually. I mean, people do acknowledge Prophet Muhammad's anti-racism. I mean, I wrote a book on it and I've made videos on it. And a lot of people who aren't even Muslim have read this book, have watched these videos, and are inspired by Prophet Muhammad's anti-racism. So I think this is another kind of danger of our modern time and the power of the media. Just because you don't see it through a screen, just because you don't see other people defending the honor of Prophet Muhammad, does not necessarily mean that people don't acknowledge his anti-racism. Now, this may contradict what I said earlier about the difference between being a non-racist and an anti-racist. Like being an anti-racist would be, coming forward and posting something, defending Muhammad, talking about his anti-racism. I mean, that's the ideal. That's what we want people to do. But I think to suggest that a lot of people won't acknowledge his anti-racism, it's just something that I haven't seen. I've actually seen a lot of people stepping forward and saying, I admire him for these reasons. And then shouldn't everyone use him as an example to spread love? I don't think we can't force people to use Muhammad as an example of love. I think all we can do is to share the knowledge that we have and to pitch the knowledge that we have in a manner that's digestible without kind of shoving it down people's throats, being forceful, and saying, this is his legacy. This is what he left us. Do I agree that ideally all people should be able to use him as an example? Yes, I do. But I'm also not expecting everyone to be on this level. It took me years to get to this level. So I guess we need to chip away and take small steps in bringing people that may not be familiar with Muhammad into the fold, so they can become more familiar slowly.
And lastly, America today doesn't view Islam as the most peaceful religion. What can we do to show people that not only are we not racist, but we are also anti-racist, and we are encouraged to spread love through communities and not hate?
So I get this question a lot, and I think I'm coming from my own perspective and my own experience as someone that has really kind of immersed himself in this encounter with Muslims. And I've come to befriend Muslims, love Muslims, a lot of Muslim friends, and so on and so forth. So from my perspective, I think Muslims are doing a great job of being model believers, model citizens, and model human beings through events like this, interfaith efforts, being hospitable, caring about education, caring about charity, caring about the country, being civically involved. I just think the problem is we, as Americans, most Americans don't see this side of Muslim Americans. And this brings me back to the media. I think that's the main problem. And I actually have been encouraging Muslims and Muslim communities when they ask me this question. I think one way to kind of convince people that Islam is not this stereotype is actually to get involved in the media and to not expect, quote, non-Muslims to have the right ideas and to craft the right narratives about who you are and what your faith is. Like you have to take control of these narratives. You have to speak for yourself. And in a media-driven world where most people are getting their information through news and newspapers and social media, this is where people learn. So I think this is critical. Muslims actually getting into the media, being more visible. And I know that's maybe not an easy kind of request, but I would like to see it, rather than me going on CNN or Fox News to talk about Islam and Muslims, like having Muslims on, like having them speak for themselves rather than having people like me speak for them. That's what I would like to see. So it's a combination of keep doing what you're doing, but also making yourself more visible. Those are my recommendations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Considine. So that actually concluded our final question that was prepared by our young members of Peace Islands Institute. I would like to shift gears and check the YouTube chat box and see if there are any questions asked by our viewers, or comments or questions. And looks like there is a comment that says, I've learned a lot from your book. It has a brand new approach and a spirit will establish the foundations of the Abrahamic movement, develop mutual understanding, and gather us all around the truth. So thank you so much for that.
I'm glad to hear that, because one thing I'd like to add here, there have been a lot of articles and videos posted about me and my work from Muslims telling other Muslims to not read my work, to not follow me, to not engage with me, because the only thing I do is say nice words about Muslims. And they basically say that's the only reason why Muslims like me is because I'm nice to Muslims. So to hear this comment from this reader who says that the book provides a perspective that they hadn't thought about, from an author's perspective, that makes me really happy. So whoever left that, thank you so much. I'd love to send you a signed copy of the book.
Thank you so much. I will get his name to you once we're done with the program as well. Do you have any final thoughts, Dr. Considine? Because everything in the chat box is all positive. Everyone's super happy and just saying great program. Thank you so much. So if you have any final thoughts, then we would love to hear that.
Well, I really appreciated the questions, and I spent a good amount of time reflecting on them. And I do think at 2 points in this session, I became pretty impassioned about the identity police and the belief police. And I think we really, all of us, because we all engage in judgment. I'm not saying I'm holier than thou and I don't do it. In fact, I guess in creating these terms, I am engaging in judgment. But I really think we need to ask ourselves as human beings and as members of communities and as members of massive faith traditions, especially Christianity and Islam, which makes up half the world's population. Why do we dedicate our time and energy to denouncing other people? Why do we do that? Why do we feel the need to tell other people that what their belief and what they believe in is wrong? Why are we doing that? How did we get to this point where we feel the need to actually type this into social media or to tell someone this? I think it's much bigger than what people were taught, because obviously people were programmed in a way to think these things. that's a theological issue, but I'm talking about the stuff that's inside people, the stuff that makes people tick. Why do people feel the need to do this? And I think if we can move away from this, transcending the condemnation to transcend the judgment, which I think is rooted in arrogance, I think it would do all of us a lot in terms of moving forward, being more constructive, being more peaceful, and being more tolerant. So I guess that's my final thought. Let people be. Let people be, so long as they're not causing chaos and mayhem and being violent and being destructive. Let people be.
I couldn't agree more with you, Dr. Considine. That was like the perfect point to finish it off with. But I would like to thank you again for taking the time to answer these questions. I know it's Super Bowl Sunday, so we actually did finish just in time for that. And secondly, I would like to thank our viewers for tuning in and also taking the time out of their Sundays to listen to Dr. Considine's insights and thoughts. So I do hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Dilara. Take
Thank
care,
you so much,
everyone.
Dr.
Take
Considine.
care.
You too.
Bye-bye.